question is no longer if, but when. Looking for life beyond Earth has been a human obsession for centuries, but it was brought into sharp relief not by scientists, but by creative spirits more than 100 years ago. H.G. Wells became a household name with imaginative works like The Time Machine and especially The War of the Worlds. French pioneering filmmaker Georges Méliès took things a stage further in 1902 with his hugely popular fantasy Voyage dans la Lune, or A Trip to the Moon. Wells was by no means the first to suggest alien eyes are upon us. Some of his predecessors were, after all, burned alive for even suggesting the possibility of life on other planets. But Wells's sustained invention was the game changer. The radio play based on his work caused widespread panic in the USA when listeners mistook what they heard for an actual alert. Two-time British Prime Minister Sir Winston Churchill, a Nobel Prize-winning man of words, penned an article in 1939 whose title was, "Are We Alone in the Universe?" "I, for one," wrote Churchill, "am not so immensely impressed by the success we are making of our civilization here that I am prepared to think we are the only spot in this immense universe which contains living, thinking creatures." Film and then television milked the idea of aliens for decades. Alas, it all amounts to nothing except a billion-dollar entertainment industry. What if, instead of waiting for aliens to come to us, we went in search of life beyond the world we know? Science is overtaking those visions. We keep looking, and we're getting better at it. Science and fiction are about to meet in the middle, when, not if, we come across life beyond Earth. We have only one reference point, our planet and the life on it. The complex DNA-based carbon life form that has infiltrated every nook and cranny of the environment on this planet, including its most hostile places. Volcanic vents on its ocean beds, its highest mountains, and its coldest regions. The assumption that organic compounds might be difficult to find in the cold, dark vastness of space is quite wrong. Space is full of them. As we have discovered in our exploration of our solar system, asteroids, comets, and meteorites do indeed carry the carbon compounds needed for life.
We discovered that this carbon was actually a very complex material, very complex carbon, very different from the simple molecules that we would expect to find there. So we don't see amino acids or alcohol or this kind of molecules which is observed in the gas, but we see something much more complex and very rich in carbon and poor in nitrogen or hydrogen compared to these other materials.
It appears the fundamental assets to make life are distributed throughout the solar system, a function of the evolution of planets. What at first glance appears a simple question, where can life be, rapidly spirals into a complex conundrum. The complexity of DNA here on Earth, and what other environments could facilitate such growth in complexity. Can biological life even get started in the harsh conditions of the solar system? Until concrete evidence is available, the question is polarizing.
I can't say for sure because we've only got the one example of life on Earth to work with so far, but all the ingredients are out there. Solar systems make everything you need for life, insofar as we know. So it could be that matter naturally organizes itself into life.
My answer to the question of whether there's life out there in the universe is, I'm afraid, I don't know. The great thing about being a scientist and not a politician is that I'm not required to have an opinion on anything. I'm only required to be able to tell you what the facts tell us. And what the evidence is that we don't know. We don't know how life on Earth got started in detail. We don't know how long it took. We don't know what the preconditions were. And so life could be incredibly common because there are lots of planets out there, or it could be an incredibly rare event that only happens, on 1 in a billion planets in a galaxy.
You want to have fluids available. So water, insofar as we know, is necessary. It's necessary for biochemistry on Earth. So you would expect that anywhere where you have liquid water or liquid organics would be good places to look for life.
Another question for scientists. The environment that hosts life now may not be the originating location for that life.
Life now occupies almost every imaginable niche. Most rainstorms are seeded on bacteria that float around in the water vapor, and then they start to nucleate water droplets and down they come. So, life is just everywhere. And it's in Antarctic ice caps and in snow patches. And so it's everywhere at the moment, and it can survive for unbelievably long periods under harsh conditions. But are those the conditions you need to make life? Those are kind of two steps we've got to almost detach our minds from in two different kind of views. So that whole idea about, where do you start life? Because the most primitive organism is already an unbelievably complex piece of machinery. It's got a membrane that isolates an interior component that's different chemistry from the outside. It's got a mechanism for mobility. It's got this incredibly complex molecule inside. So those are almost like different pieces of a puzzle put together into something that works and can then self-replicate and such. So, even before you get to that stage, you have this immense series of events that we can't even really begin to understand yet. We're starting to, but how do you get to that stage? So you almost have to detach yourself from life, where can it live now, to the building blocks of life.
Life as we know it is a complex mechanism, capable of self-replication and great diversity. But what actually is it? How do you go from a puddle of organic chemical broth exposed to some form of energy and turn into this? To know how life evolves from the fundamental organics to functioning single-cell organisms is a key to the riddle of our times. To find answers in space, we must first look back at ourselves.
One of the really key questions to ask, first of all, is actually what is life? And biologists, as well as other scientists, actually regularly debate this, what actually is life. But in my own definition, it is basically these self-contained systems where basically they are taking up energy constantly from the external environment and then using this energy to generate biomass, and this results in growth and eventually replication. One of the things that's massively debated is whether the precursors to these molecules, such as amino acids and nucleic acids, were already available on Earth before life evolved. And one really popular hypothesis is that they were, and that with the help of electricity from lightning, fundamental chemicals such as carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen were able to react to form the first amino acids, which then formed precursors to proteins, and also the first nucleic acids, which formed precursors to DNA. But my own hypothesis, and this is backed up by a number of other evolutionary biologists, is that these compounds were probably not that common in before life evolved, and instead it was life itself that started to create these compounds, and instead they basically used pre-existing energy sources in the environment, with hydrogen probably being the key one here, to fix carbon dioxide, and then use this to make organic carbon. And increasingly you would have had more sophistication developed, where you would have formed the initial amino acids, which would have then gradually elongated, becoming the first proteins, and increasingly more complex chemical catalysis would have developed. In terms of life outside Earth, it's hotly debated whether this would be dependent on the same exact building blocks, but would almost certainly also depend on organic carbon, because carbon is such a flexible molecule and also such a stable molecule where it can polymerize, and it's by having these polymers available that life is able to conduct these complex chemical reactions required to basically convert energy into usable biomass. And so by focusing on energy as this sort of universal currency for life, it then becomes more possible to predict possible environments where life could be found and where life might be able to evolve. For higher life such as ourselves, we currently are highly metabolically inflexible, so we depend on organic compounds as our energy sources, and we depend on oxygen to basically combust these energy sources and generate usable chemical energy from it. However, in the case of microorganisms, they're basically capable of an almost infinite number of perturbations upon these processes. So while some microorganisms can use organic carbon, others instead use inorganic energy sources such as hydrogen, or alternatively they might use sulfur, methane, petroleum, iron, uranium. All of these microbes have been characterized on Earth, and we basically have something that we say in my lab, which is that if there is an energy source available, you can bet that there's a microbe out there that's able to use it.
One of the first places to look for the ingredients of life is in the remnants from the early manufacture of the solar system, meteorites.
We've discovered a variety of nucleobases and nucleobase analogs in meteorites. And so what a nucleobase is the small molecule that are the building blocks of your RNA and DNA, and these molecules are essential for all of life. So this has implications for the origin of life on Earth. We know that meteorites contain amino acids, which are the building blocks of your proteins, and now from our research, we can show that nucleobases, which are the building blocks of your genetic material, like DNA and RNA, are also found in meteorites. And so these things together could have seeded an early Earth with these really important molecules that could have built up to the larger molecules you see today that are essential for biology.
Meteorites do have potential for astrobiological exploration. One thing that my group's been looking at is because they fall to planets and moons in our solar system and are sterile when they do that, and they're actually pretty delicious for microorganisms. They have a lot of available, phosphorus, which is essential for all life as we know it, sulfur, carbon, organic matter. It's not a bad place to live. And we know a lot about meteorites. They're the best studied rocks in the solar system. So you can pick one up on any, like a stony meteorite from the early days of our solar system, pick it up on any planet or moon in our solar system and know basically everything about it. So you could tell, based on our knowledge of life on Earth, whether something had been living in it and leaving behind something that we call a biomarker, a sign left behind by life.
During the violent early lives of the planets, collisions and volcanic eruptions often blasted debris into space. One such rock was cast off from Mars 17 million years ago and fell to Earth roughly 13,000 years later. It contained some contentious signs.
So there's a very controversial meteorite, the Allen Hills meteorite. In the mid-90s, there were some studies released that put forward the idea that they might have contained nanobacteria from Mars. So the Allen Hills meteorite is a Martian meteorite, so part of the crust, the surface rocks on Mars. And it would have been ejected from that surface and fallen to Earth at some point in the past. And there were morphological features that looked like microfossils. However, the results are still ambiguous. It's really difficult to determine whether a textural feature like a microfossil is true evidence of a biological process, of the presence of cells. So typically we want to use microfossils, so textural evidence, an imprint of the cells or life that were in a meteorite or in a rock from another planet or moon. So we want to look for fossils and chemical evidence in terms of organics and inorganic chemistry.
Scientists need to go back and look at the only sources of evidence for early life: fossils.
Astrobiologists are mostly concerned with microfossils, so fossilization of single-celled microorganisms or communities of them. And so you can get various conditions that will preserve microfossils, but generally the common theme is that you need to replace them or preserve them with a mineral. In some cases, you can get microorganisms that change the chemistry around them, so pH, what ions are building up around them in a solution, and just as a function of the waste products that they produce, they can end up precipitating minerals. So crystals will actually grow on them or inside the cells, and eventually preserve a record of the microorganism having been there. And you can get, say, sulfide minerals like pyrite or fool's gold. Can preserve fossils that way, and also carbonate minerals are very good at preserving a record of microorganisms as fossils.
Recent discoveries of fossilized microbes called stromatolites in Greenland are helping pinpoint the earliest evolution of life. The time window is narrowing, allowing for more accurate searches elsewhere in the solar system.
Yeah, well, it's an extraordinary discovery in really two different ways. One is that these stromatolites are preserved at all in rocks that are 3.7 billion years old. We're just talking incredibly ancient periods of time. And the exciting thing is, and we put this in the title of the paper, that we talk about a rapid emergence of life. So these rocks in Greenland are actually almost the oldest preserved rocks in the world of anything. And they're preserved in the immediate aftermath of what's known as the late heavy meteorite bombardment, which we know about from studies on the moon, was an intensive period of large bolides coming in and really impacting the Earth with incredible energy. In fact, enough energy that the oceans would have vaporized and had to recondense again, up till the period about 3.9, 3.8 billion years ago. So the thing that it's starting to point to is that, if life got started really early on Earth, and maybe it did, maybe back to 4.2 billion years ago when we know there were liquid oceans, it's hard to imagine it surviving through those incredibly energetic impact events until about 3.9, 3.8, and then we've got evidence of stromatolites at 3.7. So it's all about like, how long do you need to make life? That chemical soup, that energy to generate complexity, we always thought it took like 500 million or 1 billion years, but these discoveries are just shortening that time frame down to like 100 million years, which sounds like a lot to you and me, but actually on geological timescales, that's very short. And so it's really exciting in terms of thinking about what does that mean for generating life on other planets that don't have the long history of geology that Earth does. Like, we're still an active planet, but Mars, other planets have died because they're smaller. But then the question is, could they have formed life? Well, this foreshortened period suggests that, yeah, maybe they could. And that expands our envelope for thinking about where to search for life in the solar system, in the universe, really everywhere.
However, with these recent discoveries, a new theory is emerging into the spotlight.
At the moment, a developing paradigm shift in the community about where did life get started on the planet. So at the moment, it's known, or it's been theorized, that life started in the deep oceans by these hot vents that extrude mineralized water onto the sea floor, 400 degrees temperature. Thousands of meters below the ocean's surface, no sunlight, just chemical energy. And that's been a really evocative model for a long time. But now, people are starting to see that there are problems with that model. And it's not about life living at those vents. We know that's the case. We can see it with our rovers when we go down. We see these big tube worms and crabs and everything. But before you get life, you have to make organic molecules become more complex. So organic molecules are simple, they're everywhere, they come in from meteorites and comets and dust falling in and stuff. But to make them complicated, to make them long chain, you've got to stick those bits together. And the funny thing is that sticking those bits together requires not just wetting, but drying conditions. Each of those reactions that makes an organic molecule longer requires a water molecule to be kicked out. So the community is starting to realize that actually you can't make life in the oceans. It's actually too wet. So we're now, and with a group of us, looking at hot springs, because hot springs on the surface of the Earth have all the conditions of the deep sea smokers. They're not as hot, so that's actually better. And they have the capacity for wetting and drying cycles on the edge of hot springs pools that have geysers, they erupt and they expand and they detract. And so you get these wetting, drying cycles. That provides the power and the energy for making complex organic molecules. And their chemistry is very complicated. Each hot spring is different. One's pH 2, one's pH 7, one's pH 11. They've got different nutrients, different chemicals. And you mix and match all those things together. And all of a sudden you've got complexity that could make life in something like 10 million years. So this is a new model that we've just published in Scientific American, very exciting, and it's applicable to Mars. Because it looks like from the history of the geology of Mars that actually it never had oceans. But it had volcanoes and it had hot springs. So if our ideas about the origin of life are changing from the deep oceans, where we'd say, why would you go to Mars? They never had deep oceans, so life wouldn't start there. To hot springs, all of a sudden Mars are going, very exciting.
The next obvious target for scientists is our age-old agent provocateur, Mars, the closest in time and space to our Earth, and the best first chance of evidence of non-terrestrial life.
Absolutely. We're looking at exactly the same window of time as the discoveries from Greenland through to our well-known work in the Pilbara in Western Australia, where there's the most convincing evidence of life. The whole community's satisfied about it. But that window, 3.8 to 3.5, is exactly the time in the history of Mars that we know it had warm and wet conditions, or at least wet conditions with abundant flowing water. And so that's exactly the window that we're looking at. And that's why these areas are so important as analogs, because they really are, a window back onto this incredibly deep time period. And at the same time on Mars, when things were still going on there, we still had volcanoes that were providing heat and volcanic activity and chemical complexity and water-rock interaction. Those are all the things, ingredients that we need for life on Earth. And we know that we had them on Mars. So that's why we're looking at these comparisons and going, that's the time and the place to look.
The next Mars rover mission, Rover 2020, is fast approaching. Scientists and technicians have one shot at finding ancient signs of life, so their landing site selection is a serious business.
We're literally on the advisory team for one of the landing sites for the Mars 2020. We've gone over the past 2 years to the landing site workshops where they're whittling down the numbers, and at the moment they're top 3 sites candidate for the Mars 2020 mission, and ours is still one of them. And that's to go and look at what appear to be, from all the evidence we have, hot spring deposits. These silica-rich deposits from extruding hot water that's coming out of the ground and flowing over the landscape. And we're so excited about that because the work that we've done in the Pilbara has shown that at 3.5 billion years ago, the same age as the crust on Mars, this ancient life on Earth was thriving in active hot springs with geysers depositing opaline silica. And they found from one of the previous rover studies on Mars, the Spirit rover, found opaline silica deposits. And they've got textures. I mean, this is totally mind-blowing. They've got textures like these little fingers coming out of these silica things. So it's not just boring layered rock. These have vertical structures, finger-like structures, and they found identical structures in hot springs active today in these very high desert areas in Chile, the most Mars-like conditions you could ask for. Bang, we've got the same structures, opaline silica, these finger-like structures, and on Earth, they're made by microbes. So we're saying, go to those known hot spring deposits on Mars.
Another area of interest is the detection of methane gas in the atmosphere. More tantalizing clues of possible life processes.
I reckon that's geological. So there are geological processes that will produce organic molecules, including methane, including the process of serpentinization, which is when you have, essentially you heat up magnesium and iron-rich rocks and add water into them so you hydrate it. It's what we call a metamorphic reaction. And that can generate organic matter or organic chemicals. That's well known from studies on Earth. I really hope that we do find fossilized microorganisms on Mars. That would be a triumph for science and for humanity. I'm not holding my breath, though. It could be a long journey to try to find a record there, but it's probably our best hope in the solar system.
There is another consideration when looking for alien life, in particular on Mars: contamination. Earthly bacteria can easily ride the rocket through space and land on Mars with the probe, leaving the distinct possibility of contaminating and possibly destroying the very thing we are looking for.
Yeah, look, this is a real possibility. And there's a group in NASA, and I'm sure that other agencies have them as well, called planetary protection officers, who take the most careful steps imaginable to try and protect a planet from seeding with our own sort of bacteria community that we bring in with us everywhere. And so that's the main reason why the Mars 2020 mission is not going to look for active, like existing life, because we know there's water flowing on Mars. It's coming out from the subsurface, but we know that can live on Earth, no problem. But they're not going there because they're worried that if they put in a sampler, they might introduce bacteria that ride on spaceships, and we know it can survive in space. So they're avoiding that altogether and going for the ancient life in rocks, where there's not the possibility of contaminating an existing water body. So yeah, there's great care being taken by, at least by some groups.
Beyond Mars, the next outposts in our solar system to be potential habitats for life are the ice moons of Jupiter and Saturn. Dr. Helen Maynard-Casely has been studying the planetary conditions of these icy worlds in the laboratory.
So as I said, my expertise is sort of recreating those surface and interior conditions of the icy moons in order to sort of understand what the materials are doing and how they interact there. But from the various space missions that we've sent out to Europa and Enceladus, we know, or at least infer quite a lot about their structures. So Europa, everybody gets very excited about because we believe that it has got quite a thick ice crust, or thin or thick, again, we're not entirely sure how much, but there's a global ocean underneath that ice, and that should boundary straight onto a rock mantle, a rock inner core. So at that interface, you've got rock and water, quite warm, like probably more than room temperature, so you've got potential for that water to pluck out minerals, nutrients, and then of course that whole ocean is shielded from the intense radiation of Jupiter. So it's a rather snug little place to be.
So I think, that the community is fascinated by the fact that there's water, known water, and liquid water in these very far-off moons of Jupiter and Saturn. But this gets back to the origin of life, right? So we have life occupying these chemical hot springs down deep in the oceans, and they're some of the most primitive organisms, no doubt. But it gets back to that question of, how do you make something that's as complex of life from very simple building blocks? If you can't do it in the oceans, then I would say you're wasting your time going to Europa and Enceladus, because those deep oceans would never have the wetting drying cycles. So they probably and very likely have the kind of elements we see in the deep oceans on Earth. They may have hot smokers, they may have mineralized water-rock interactions, but from our group's perspective, if you never had an exposed land surface, you probably never got life. And so without that, yeah, we'd really question whether it's worth going.
Perhaps meteors punch through the ice crust to deliver the additional organic chemistry required.
Potentially, yes. I've seen that there's a big change in the craters. So there are craters on the surface of Europa. Let's talk here. The surface of Europa is very young geologically. It's at most 100 million years old, which is why a lot of people get excited about the potential of activity. Craters up to about 30 kilometers are pretty normal. They compare normal for an icy satellite. They compare quite well with the similar sized craters adjusted for gravity on Ganymede and on Callisto. Now, once you get above 30 kilometers, they change very dramatically in morphology. You don't get the sort of big crater, you don't get such the crater shape, you get a sort of ring-like structure. Now, again, the modelling of that is not complete, but you could imagine that that's happened because something's actually punched all the way through, and then water is sort of squidged through, and it would maybe form that. There's a big debate as to how thick or thin the Europa crust is, but I believe that from the cratering record people see, it points to it more being in the 20 kilometres range. That's good because it would definitely protect anybody down there. It's bad because it's very difficult for us to get down there and actually go and find them. So we'll still see. Enceladus, though, which is one of the moons of Saturn, is, I believe, quite a surprise. It's absolutely tiny, and so when Cassini got there and saw these massive geysers coming out, the first big question is, where is all the heat coming from? And it's something that there's potential that it's tidal friction, or is it radiogenic heating? And there's still not a sort of definite, right, it's definitely this, but we know there is a lot of heat coming out of Enceladus. And it is very, very small. And now we know that from Cassini, the way it sort of passed by Enceladus, we know that there is an ocean underneath the South Pole. So again, the other potential's there. But whether that ocean is trapped in ice or actually goes all the way down to the rock, we're not sure yet. So certainly the ingredients seem to be there. I mean, or we infer the ingredients there. If the water, the ocean goes all the way down to that rock crust and you've got water-rock interactions, then there is also the potential that if it's too deep, the pressure of the water can go so high that you actually solidify the water. It becomes solid ice. So Europa's one moon, but it has a much bigger sister, Ganymede. And it was thought that Ganymede would have an internal ocean. In fact, actually, internal oceans are sort of seen as a must-have for most icy moons now. And the reason why people got less excited about Ganymede was thought that the ocean would be so deep that the water would then freeze and isolate everything from the rock, and so you couldn't get these interactions. However, there's been more work that looked at the interactions of the dirty stuff, the potential salt in Ganymede's ocean, and that actually it could cause layers, so you could potentially get a solid, liquid, solid, liquid, solid, liquid ocean. And a few of the models worked out that you could get liquid in contact with the rock. So I think there's a lot of justification in doing a lot more study in the potential of taking those ingredients that could be in the bottom of Europa and Ganymede and potentially Callisto, because there's a lot of environments that we think like that in the solar system, and to find out a bit more about how the biology might work down there.
Discovering geysers emanating from the moon, Cassini was retasked to fly through the plumes and make close-up observations.
So they managed to detect, I think, at least CO2 and methane, for instance, but really what they want to look for is the potential of amino acids, the building blocks, proteins. And so that's why there's now a proposal to send another mission there. It's called ELF, or Enceladus Life Finder. They would fly a better, more sensitive mass spectrometer that would be able to directly detect the potential of amino acids. Now, amino acids don't necessarily mean life, and I know that the ELF science team have come up with a sort of cube matrix of observations. Amino acids is just one of those, and there's a number of other things, parameters in that sort of cube. What could they detect for in order to say that there's actually something in there?
Titan, the moon of Saturn, has always drawn attention to itself. A mysterious satellite with a dense and cloudy atmosphere, liquid oceans, rocky terrain, and abundant carbon organics.
So Titan's the first planetary body apart from our own Earth to see liquid on the surface, and that's these big lakes and seas that are ethane and methane, and it's got a very thick atmosphere, much thicker than our own atmosphere. Because of that, it controls the temperature very well on the surface. So globally, around minus 180 degrees C, and it hardly varies from that value. So if you want to study the surface of Titan, from my point of view, it makes it very easy. All I have to do is go drive to 90 Kelvin and just and sit around there. So you've got those conditions, you've got very thick nitrogen, but there's also methane in the atmosphere. Now that methane was always a bit of a mystery. It was actually first discovered by Gerald Kuiper back in 1944. And it got everybody a bit interested because methane shouldn't really be held on to by Titan. It's quite small, doesn't have quite the gravitational field. The methane should have escaped into space. And so automatically there was like, well, where's that methane coming from? That starts to get Titan a little bit more interesting. But then, of course, you've got this methane, you've got this nitrogen, and you've got this atmosphere that isn't well protected, doesn't have a magnetic field like we do on Earth. And so you've got all this cosmic and solar radiation that causes interactions to happen. And you see interactions into bigger organics, things like benzene, acrylonitrile, anything with C, H and N, pretty much. There's a pathway that potentially can form. This bigger stuff starts forming and then starts raining down onto the surface. So you've got this very, whenever you see Titan, it's very orange and hazy, and that's what this organic haze is. And this is thought to have been going on for a very, very long time, so much so that any water ice that's on the surface of Titan has been buried completely, that there's actually just a massive carpet of organic material.
Recently discovered vinyl cyanide, C2H3CN, is an organic molecule which helps form biological membranes in the atmosphere.
These molecules have been recently discovered on Saturn's moon Titan. And this is quite an exciting discovery because these molecules are the building blocks of what's needed for forming the cell membrane. And the cell membrane defines the barrier of a cell, and protects the inside components of a cell from its outside environment so that the cell can metabolize and grow and divide.
It's hypothesized that for the very earliest life forms, there were probably already naturally existing membranes in these hydrothermal vents that the bacteria were basically able to use to partition these chemical processes. And certainly in systems such as Titan, where there are also these membranes available, perhaps this could actually serve as a useful precursor for, again, these self-replicating chemical systems to evolve. It's not the only thing they will require, but it could certainly help and basically have these micro-environments developing for life to develop.
The next possible habitat is the outer reaches of the solar system, a newly visited world showing a complex environment with the potential to harbour microscopic life.
If you go in closer to the surface, you can see this type of really diverse terrain. So you have a very bright region. These are flat plains. Not entirely sure how they formed yet, but there's a couple of leading theories. There's a huge range of mountains. There's all kinds of different aged surfaces. Some of them have lots of craters. Some of them have very few, which means they're younger. If you look in a lot of detail at some of the mountainous regions, you can see that actually they're a few kilometers high, but they're made of water ice. I mean, that's on Pluto. It's so cold that water ice is the hardest thing. It's more like rock. And so the stuff that forms the softer material is actually nitrogen ice. One of the really fascinating things is some of the surface coloration you can see in these images actually shows that there are these compounds called tholins, which are a combination of elements, but they're related to prebiotic molecules, so they're kind of relevant to prebiotic chemistry. And I think the fact that they have been able to form on planetary surfaces very far out in the solar system at very cold temperatures really has implications for a lot of places. I mean, if you can imagine for star systems outside our own, where the star may be dim and the planets are quite far away, it's interesting to know that there are molecules that could be involved in supplying biotic material to processes that may one day lead to life or be involved in life or something like that. That they're actually forming way out in the solar system where no one really expected.
We know that microbes can continue to have a very low but useful amount of metabolism in extremely cold and extremely dry environments. So, for instance, in these Antarctic soils that we sampled, we were observing that microbes in there could very easily oxidize molecules such as hydrogen at temperatures as low as minus 20 degrees, and these were in incredibly dry soils. So I'd imagine that in certain planets where they have very low temperatures and are very dry, it would be possible, if there is an energy source, for at least a very, very low level of metabolism to occur. And according to all the, basically this comes down to thermodynamics, and with a warmer planet, then as long as it's not too warm, then metabolism will be more favorable, and this will yield much faster evolutionary processes. But certainly in reasonably cold environments, maybe down to minus 80 degrees or so, you can still have microbes survive and do some very, very low level of metabolism to at least tick over, maybe not necessarily grow.
Yeah, so listen, organic molecules are extremely complex. So carbon is one of the most common elements in the universe. And we know that it's on comets. There was that beautiful Rosetta mission that landed and sampled there. But they're very, very simple molecules. And so same with the organic molecules that have been found so far on Mars and the ones that are inferred on Pluto, they're very, very simple. Now, the exciting thing about Pluto is what we didn't know until we got closer up, is that it's got a complex history. We can see different domains, and that means there was activity there. And if there's activity, like geological activity, and organic molecules, and a surface, then there's interesting stuff going on. So actually, that looks like an interesting environment. The missing part of that equation in terms of thinking about complex life is the sun is so unbelievably faint at Pluto that you'd never have probably the possibility for photosynthesis, which is what allows oxygen to rise and allows for complex like us and elephants to be around. That's a whole nother step away. So we wouldn't predict, a complex advanced civilization on Pluto, but maybe microbes.
The search for life beyond our Earth is a daunting prospect. And yet, the signs of building blocks are everywhere.
I can't say for sure, because we've only got the one example of life on Earth to work with so far, but all the ingredients are out there. Solar systems make everything you need for life, insofar as we know. So it could be that matter naturally organizes itself into life.
Within our solar system, we are studying all the places where life might well evolve. Mars, for example, once had two of the essentials, free-flowing water and volcanoes. Then there are the ice moons of the giant planets, Europa and Ganymede, with their internal oceans. Even the far-flung Pluto has shown some interesting signs. There is, however, only one ideal environment in our solar system, Earth. To find other such oases, we must look for exoplanets around other star systems, a very difficult challenge.
Well, there's sort of two things that are driving the places that we look for exoplanets. The planetary systems where we'd most like to be able to find planets just like our own, that orbit at just the right distance from their host star to potentially be able to host life, are orbiting stars just like our own. So they're what are known as G-type stars. But the difficulty is that the distance that a planet orbits around one of those stars, with a period of around 1 year, means that the signatures for seeing those planets are really, really small. So they're incredibly technically challenging to find planets around sun-like stars. So the next best category, the sorts of systems that we're putting a lot of effort into, are stars that are much smaller than the sun, about 1/10 the size of the sun. You get a type of star that's called an M dwarf. It's very red, it's very faint, and as a result, the distance where you get the same amount of flux as you get from the sun shrinks in to about the orbit of Mercury, or inside the orbit of Mercury. And that makes the signatures for detecting that planet much easier to find. And so there's a lot of effort going into looking for what we call habitable zone planets around these small M dwarf stars. There are two basic ways that we can find planets around other stars, and both of them look for the indirect effect of the planet on the star. We don't see the planet itself, we see what the planet does to the star. And we either see the planet orbiting within the line of sight and crossing the disk of the star and making it a little bit dimmer. Those are what are called transit planets. Or we see the planet orbiting around the star and making the star move backwards and forwards along the line of sight. And we can measure the velocity of the star. Basically, we use telescopes as giant speed guns to measure the star going backwards and forwards. And those are what are called Doppler detections of these planets. And for transit searches, finding multiple planets is a lot easier. Most of the multiple planet systems we've found have come from space-based transit searches like the Kepler mission. For Doppler searches, finding the subsequent planets gets harder and harder and harder. As you go to larger and larger separations from the star, the wobble signature of the star moving backwards and forwards gets smaller, and it gets progressively harder and harder to find. So what we found is that there are lots and lots of multi-planet systems out there. I don't know that it's true that they're less or more common than we at first thought. They require more intensive observations. When you're looking for a planet around another star, the first planet you find is the easiest planet to find. And then finding the subsequent planets usually involves getting more and more and more data so that you can see usually the much smaller signal on maybe a longer period that tells you there's another planet. And then once you've found those two, if you want to find a subsequent one, then you've got to get even more data.
To this end, 2 new space observatories are soon to be launched. TESS, NASA's transiting exoplanet survey satellite, designed to find planets crossing the face of their sun, and the much-lauded James Webb Space Telescope. It will be able to see and analyze the atmospheres of those distant planets.
So we have 4 key contributions. We are supplying 2 out of the 4 scientific instruments. We are responsible for the launch of James Webb from French Guiana with the Ariane 5 rocket. And we also supply personnel for the operation of James Webb Space Telescope from the Space Telescope Science Institute.
So James Webb has been built initially to see galaxies and when they form. So the galaxies are this assembly of stars, and we are trying to look at really the first 100 million years of the universe and look at their formation. But at the end of the day, it's going to do much more than that, and in particular, a very exciting field where it will do a lot of bring exciting results, or exoplanets. You know, characterizing the atmosphere of planets orbiting over stars. That's really exciting.
TESS and the James Webb Telescope will be ready for launch within the year and are expected to open up a whole new era of discovery.
So there are the things we expect Webb to do, such as see the very first stars and galaxies to light up after the Big Bang. So we know we've designed it for that. We expect it to do that. Additionally, we expect that people will use it to study the atmospheres of exoplanets. But as a scientist, what I look for are those unique uses that no one has planned for, because it's out of those unexpected discoveries that most of the excitement arises.
To date, there are over 3,500 confirmed exoplanets, double that again yet to be confirmed, and of those over 360 are terrestrial planets. Some are even classed as super-Earths.
The reason why the TESS mission is exciting compared to, or in addition to Kepler, is that Kepler has told us an enormous amount about the statistics of how many planets are present around stars. So it tells us that the frequency of very small planets is quite common. So planets on around about the sort of the size of the Earth seem to exist around almost every star as far as we can see, often in very short periods, much too short to be habitable, but they're relatively common. But what it doesn't tell us about is the properties of those planets. So because when you find a transit planet, you're essentially seeing a dark thing moving across the disk of a bright thing. The only thing that transit detection tells you is about the period of the planet and the size of the planet, is its physical radius. What we really want to know is the size of the planet and its mass. Because if you know the size and the mass, then you know the density. And if you know the density, you know whether it's a gassy planet like Jupiter, or an icy planet like Neptune, or a rocky planet like the Earth or Venus or Mars. Before we found exoplanets, before we found planets around other stars in 1995, everybody expected that planet formation elsewhere would produce systems that look just like our solar system. And for about 20 years, what we consistently found was thousands of planetary systems that look nothing like our solar system. We've got gas giant planets that orbit inside the orbit of Mercury. You've got gas giant planets that orbit where Venus, Earth, and Mars are. You've got planets in highly eccentric orbits, highly non-circular orbits. Almost all the orbits in our solar system are really quite circular. Most exoplanets, most planets around other stars, don't have those nice circular orbits. We find system architectures that are very, very different from our own, which suggests that maybe the structure of our own solar system is not the norm. Maybe it's unusual for reasons that we still don't understand. Planetary system, even just the Earth, is an incredibly complex system. And we are yet to understand the sort of multiplicity of what other planetary systems look like. The other thing to bear in mind is that saying that other planetary systems should look like our own solar system is an incredibly risky assumption to make.
The variety of planets we are finding is indeed fascinating, from hot gas giants of various sizes to terrestrials varying in dimension from moon size up to 2 or 3 times the size of Earth.
So, finding planets is hard. It's really hard. Finding life is that much harder still. At the moment, the prime focus of most of the people who are looking for planets around other stars is not so much to look for signatures of life, but look for signatures of habitability. That is, an environment that is similar to what we see here on the Earth. So, a roughly Earth-sized planet at roughly the same sort of separation from its host star, modulo the brightness of the star. And then potentially saying, well, Can we see the properties of the atmosphere? Can we see whether it's got water in it? Can we see whether it's dominated by thick clouds of sulfuric acid like Venus, in which case it's probably not going to be habitable, or has it got a relatively thin atmosphere like the Earth? The Earth's atmosphere is actually quite tenuous compared to the atmospheres of lots of planets. So it's sort of finding out those properties. That's even harder. The next step is what are the signatures of life that you look for? Do you look for methane emissions? Do you look for the signatures of molecular oxygen? So when the Earth first formed, there was no molecular oxygen in the atmosphere. Oxygen is a byproduct largely of life, of the cyanobacteria that formed in the oceans very earlier on. So those are the sorts of signatures that you could try to look for. A lot of that is sort of guesswork because we don't really know how life on our own Earth got started. Trying to guess what life on another planet would look like, we're sort of limited to looking for something just like ourselves. There's no guarantee that the only pathway for life is to look just like us.
The visible stars above us at night most likely all contain planets, and not just one. The keys to confirming these discoveries are highly sensitive spectrographs here on the ground, like the European Observatory that uses the extremely successful HARPS.
So we're building a new facility to do the Doppler follow-up that I was talking about before. You need very specialized pieces of equipment attached to very large telescopes to do this. If you remember, because planets are small, stars are big, the wobble that is produced by a planet going around a star is very small. Jupiter produces a wobble in velocity of about 12 meters a second. So it makes the sun move at about the speed of Usain Bolt. And it does it with a period of around about 12 years. Now, measuring the speed of Usain Bolt sounds straightforward to do, except that you're trying to do it around something that is extremely faint and somewhere between 50 and 100 parsecs away. And so you're having to calibrate your system to extraordinary levels of precision. That's to find an easy planet like Jupiter. If you want to find a tiny planet like the Earth, you've got to get down to precisions in the velocity that you're measuring of well below a meter per second. And that's why we need to build specialized facilities to go on our telescopes, like the Veloce spectrograph, which sits in basically in a big box. It's pressure controlled, it's temperature controlled, it's got a state-of-the-art laser comb where we pulse a laser with extremely high precision to make a calibration signal to inject into it. And you need a big telescope, at least a 4-meter telescope like the Anglo-Australian telescope, or bigger ones. Similar facilities are being built on 8-meter class telescopes and larger. So the European Southern Observatory have been running the HARPS spectrograph on their 3.6-meter telescope at the Lucia Observatory in Chile for over 10 years now. And it is, again, another one of these ultra-stabilized, very complex spectrographs. We have adopted for Veloce slightly different design strategies in a number of different ways because we have a different site and a different telescope. But it is focused on very much the same sort of science, and it, along with us and a number of other facilities worldwide, will be engaged in the big international endeavour of following up the results from TESS. One of the things that Kepler taught us, it found thousands of exoplanets. And when they started that mission, the follow-up programs were essentially limited to just the people who were in the TESS science teams. And they quickly found that there was not enough telescope time available to them and not enough telescopes in order to exploit the treasure trove of data that came out of Kepler. So we've learnt from that. The TESS mission, the data is essentially freely made available once it's been processed by the TESS team. It's put on a website, and then everybody around the world will be trying to coordinate, but also trying to compete to find the most interesting planets coming out of that. The main point being that there is so much data, even using all of the telescopes and all of the facilities available to us, there will still be objects which don't get observed and don't get followed up. So we and HARPS will be both competitors and collaborators in following up the results from TESS. And of course, the interesting thing is that for almost the first time in the history of modern astronomy, southern hemisphere chauvinism has been reversed. So TESS is surveying the southern hemisphere first. So we get first dibs on all of that data ahead of those northern hemispherites.
With the new technology about to come online, the speed and success of planet finding and confirmation will increase considerably, allowing us to better target the planets of most interest to us. Planets too close to their stars, stripped of atmosphere. Solar flares sterilizing the planet's surface. Terrestrials baked in unforgiving sunlight. Planets beyond the habitable zone, icy or frozen. A planet entirely covered with water is another possibility.
And what we're working on is better understanding that origin of life setting. What is the chemistry required? What are the interactions that make the steps to get to complexity? Do you need 100 fields? Can you do it in one? What are the other? So there's a whole field of investigation that's building about understanding Darwin's warm little pond. He foresaw this 145 years ago, and we're now just finally catching up to his prescient insight and really starting to try and scientifically address that. And that is very exciting. That's what excites me in the morning.
From Darwin's warm little pond come bacteria, then algae, perhaps a world dominated by algae.
Yes, well, if you a product of science fiction is that we all assume that that other planets should end up looking more like our own, except maybe the grass is a different color and a different shape. In practice, because we understand so little about how life got started here on the Earth, it's incredibly hard to understand whether that situation holds or not. And it makes for, fascinating literature and a great discussion to have down the pub, but it's not science yet.
What if eukaryotes diversified differently than on Earth, branching only 3 or 4 times, never seeding the world of animals, plants becoming the dominant life form?
So what we expect to find on other planets, in some ways we don't know that they'd be different in the broad view, because organisms still have to be able to do the same things. They have to be able to get energy, they have to be able to get nutrients, convert all those to useful products, and they have to be able to reproduce. So organisms are always going to have these characteristics, and we are confident that in order for animals or any organisms to become more successful, there has to be some sort of natural selection. So the way natural selection works is that you have variation amongst individuals. There are many more individuals that are made that can survive in the environment. Those that are better able to do their job have more kids, and we start moving along that trajectory of accumulating adaptations, things that they're able to do better than others outside. So these basic processes are going to be what drives the change in life over time. Well, there's a lot of basic physical conditions that are going to be common throughout planets and the life forms that evolve on them. And so being able to sense distance, I guess, is one of those things. Could you get better depth perception with more than 2 eyes? It's hard for us to tell. Well, so many animals have many more than 2 or 3 eyes, and it depends really what you want your eyes for. So there are lots of organisms that have very simple eyes. Say a jellyfish has light-sensing organs that go all the way around its body, and these are able to help it move towards or away from light. But if you want to be able to actually form images more than just light sensing, these are structures that have to be evolved, and they take up more space. They presumably also take some degree of brain power to be able to process that image and make them useful. So if you had only 2 eyes and they could basically see 180 degrees or more than that, is that ever going to be, are you ever going to need more than that? But we always know that the further apart you put the eyes, the better your depth of perception will be. I guess one of the things that might be advantageous of having multiple eyes is you could have different eyes that do different things. So there are some fish that spend most of their time underwater, and so to make it so that eyes work well underwater, you make your optics, the lenses, act well underwater. But then if the fish wants to look above the water, the optics are all different, so they can evolve separate eyes or separate parts of eyes that are designed for looking through air rather than through water. So having multiple eyes that do different things would be an advantage.
How about mobility? How many legs are best?
Two legs is pretty unusual. So 2 legs is not an advantage for most of the situations because they're quite unstable. And so it takes us more effort to be able to stand on 2 legs. We're more unstable, more likely to be knocked over. If we run on 2 legs, we're more likely to trip and fall than an animal with 4 legs, where you can have additional points of contact with the ground. And running fast is actually easier with 4 legs compared to 2, with a galloping gait rather than a running gait. But when we look throughout the animal kingdom, we have a lot of different diversity in the number of legs, if we're talking terrestrial animals. And we know that more primitive arthropods like millipedes and centipedes have dozens of legs on their body. But arguably more successful groups like insects have said 6 is enough for me. And so they have sort of set their body plan to say, I only need 6 legs. I can do a lot, I can change those to do different jobs, but with those 6 legs, I can become the most diverse group of animals that we've ever known. There are other variations on that. You get spiders that have 8, you have crab-like animals that have 10. So part of the decision of how many legs you have is how adaptable can you make any of those legs. If you do have lots of sets of legs, that's going to limit some things that you can do. If you're always going to have a long, thin body with lots of similar legs, you won't necessarily be able to make big, strong claws for doing particular jobs. You won't be able to change your back half of your body to fit all of your digestive organs or your reproductive organs, which is what insects do. They've taken all their legs off their abdomen, then they have this large structure that it's not filled in with all the muscles and joints of legs. They can now put a lot of their organs in those. So in many ways, getting rid of some legs is useful. Well, we know that looking at animals now, we're looking at a tiny fraction of the total diversity of life that has ever existed on Earth. So we have a very biased view in what we think is possible. But looking back in the fossil record, we can see that animals that in some ways defy description have existed. We don't know exactly how they lived, and we imagine that many of these were sort of evolutionary dead ends. They tried something out. It was successful for a while, but something outcompeted them, something ate them to extinction, and extinction events themselves will have taken portions of that diversity away.
If life were well established on a distant planet, filling every possible niche, would it suffer extinction events similar to those that happened here on Earth? Is that in fact necessary for evolution to produce a technologically advanced intelligence?
Probably the very earliest extinction event that occurred on Earth was what's called the Great Oxygenation event, where basically the Earth converted from what was almost entirely an anoxic environment, so there was no oxygen available, into something that's highly oxic like it is today. So oxygen started to emerge in the atmosphere. And it's thought that this process occurred because basically single-celled organisms called cyanobacteria first started to evolve. And what these do is a process called oxygenic photosynthesis, which is basically where they fix carbon using light, and they generate oxygen as a byproduct from this. So they basically perform a very similar function to what plants do.
The majority of the history of life has been single-celled organisms. So we know that it was very difficult for organisms to get past that.
Earth has endured 5 mass extinction events in her history. There is a case for saying that we humans are the direct result of those events, which were catastrophic for other species.
I think we would definitely expect that if the formation mechanisms of planets on other stars, around other stars, are similar to the solar system, then yes, you would expect that there would be impacts on other planets in the same way that they've been here on Earth. One of the important things to remember is that not all of the extinction events that we've had here on Earth are believed to have been mediated by impacts. Some of them have been mediated by global climate change, sort of snowball Earth events, which are thought to have had more to do with where the continents and the plates are on the Earth, and therefore where the snow and ice formed, and how the feedback processes changed from us having our the current environment to a much more tropical environment, much warmer planet, which we've had in the past, to much colder planets, which we've also had in the past.
One thing we do know about evolution is that, there's a certain number of available habitats. And when they get filled up, life doesn't actually need to evolve very much because it fills those habitats. So, the dinosaurs and that community was around for 150 million years. They were pretty successful. They filled up essentially all the different niche space with the plants and everything else and stuff, and the pterodactyls in the sky. And it took a meteorite impact to break that effective filling of the niches.
After that time of around 66 million years ago, when this major extinction event happened, there has been phases of cooling of the Earth, and perhaps that would have greatly affected dinosaurs in different ways from the extinction event. And that's one of the things that mammals have been able to diversify into is this change to a cooling Earth that increased body size and furredness has enabled them to fill those roles.
And so these extinction events, these impacts or giant volcanic events that change the atmosphere and stuff, they're almost like wiping the slate clean and you can start over again. And so then life adapts very quickly during those change periods and fills that niche space again, but it does so in a different form. And that's where these evolutionary steps are able to develop. And at each step you could argue that there's increased complexity, but one of the things we're finding out is that we're not alone in being intelligent, right? Dolphins are very intelligent. They're the top predator in their niche space. There's all this incredibly complex interactions between predator-prey and, building up chemical arsenals. And it's just incredible what happens on a daily basis. And so you could argue that development of intelligence is an inevitable consequence of increasing complexity and development through time, whether it's in the form of a human or a porpoise or a dragonfly or something, Once they have to figure out ways to solve problems to be competitive and develop the right tools, then there's that possibility of developing great complexity. Because you and I, and really all life on Earth, is just a matter of organizational principles. It's really just complexity, right? So we're able somehow to stand on 2 legs, whereas most walk around on 4, but that's an adaptation to environment with this changed niche space. So you could argue that if you let that experiment run again and again and for longer and longer, that you would probably end up with something that has intellectual capability in terms of problem solving. And we know that now. We know many animals, even spiders, use tools. So, we're finding we're less and less unique, but the level of complexity and adaptability is certainly, at a very high level in humans. And time is a great friend, Time gives you that ability to complexify. But the extinctions, maybe they were a really critical marker in terms of allowing this form of complexity to develop.
Other considerations when it comes to exoplanet environments have to include differing gravity, atmospheric density, and planetary spin around the star.
Within a reasonable degree of changing gravity, I don't think that would have a big difference. Only with a massive change in gravity would I think things were different. But if, say, you decrease the gravity a lot, that would make flight easier. So maybe you'd find many more animals that are flying or gliding than we do on Earth. If you made gravity stronger, you'd probably decrease the frequency of flight because it takes more energy to be able to overcome that force of gravity.
What about size? Would differing gravity create larger creatures?
Depends in part if you live in the air or underwater, because when you live underwater, you are supported a lot more. So the largest animals that we've ever known live in the sea. They're the blue whales. And so their skeleton and their limbs don't have to be able to hold their entire mass. for living on land, there's some that suspect that the maximum size of vertebrates that we've seen, which include the dinosaurs and some mammals are still relatively big according to that. We think that their body size was not limited by the mechanics, it was by being able to get enough food to feed a very large animal. So being able to find a high enough energy food source and being able to move over the environment to get that seems to have been one of the major factors that limited their maximum size. So we think that they could probably get bigger, but they'd have to be able to feed themselves and have a big enough population to sustain themselves over a long time. If you had a very fast spinning planet where you're changing from night to day very frequently, you would get less specialization in animals that do stuff at night and animals that do stuff during the day. I would expect they would just be adapted to exist throughout that whole night-day cycle. And then if you go the opposite way, where you have a planet like Mercury where the same face always faces the sun, it's possible that it's way too hot on the side that faces the sun and way too cold on the other. And we might imagine that there's some sort of lovely habitable zone in that small gap between them where all life happens. And they then only have a single night-day combination for the whole of their life.
In 1961, astronomer and astrophysicist Frank Drake came up with an equation to determine the number of intelligent extraterrestrial civilizations that might exist in the Milky Way at any one time. Several factors of the equation are highly conjectural, leaving a great deal of uncertainty about the answer.
So the Drake equation essentially combines together a bunch of different uncertainties. It breaks the problem of, do we think that there's intelligent life out there in the universe that could talk to us, down into a series of terms. So there's a term for the rate at which stars form in our galaxy, which we actually know reasonably well. Then there's a term for the rate at which stars have habitable planets orbiting around them, which we're starting to get a handle on. It's probably, somewhere between 1 and 100% of stars. And then there's a term for the time it takes life to evolve, which frankly, we've got almost no idea about what the mean time is for that happen. We think on Earth, it took somewhere between 100 and 500 million years for life to first get started. And then there's the rate at which intelligent life forms. And we have absolutely no idea. We have absolutely no idea how you go from the time scale to go from bacterial life or pre-bacterial life to multicellular life, to eukaryotes, which are multiple cells all living together. And then you get to multicellular organisms. So we don't know how long or how common that is. And then there's the whole, how long does intelligent life last? And we have no idea about that. So there's a few terms in the Drake equation that we know. The rest of them are essentially completely unknown. And when you multiply together a whole bunch of completely unknowns, you've got still completely unknown. So we really don't know. It's a handy way to think about how difficult the problem is, and it reinforces that the problem is incredibly difficult to understand.
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think there's two components to that, probably. So the Drake equation has 9 components to the equation, I think, something like that. And each one of those has a lot of unknown variables. So, if you say you're off by a factor of 100 in one of those variables, and maybe one of the variables is actually, how many stars are in the universe, we might be off by factors of billions. If you have 9 variables and you add those all up, that's a big numbers game. The other thing is that we occupy a very particular time slice. And so, if you think of our capacity to generate a radio signal that can be beamed across the universe, that's an infinitesimally small sliver of time, right? We've had an advanced society since 200 years or something, or whatever. And it's nothing. The universe is 13.7 billion years old, right? So what's the chance of being at the right place at the right time to intercept a signal that sweeps by 200 years, right? So it's just a numbers game.
Beyond our solar system, the next location for habitation is our nearest stellar neighbor, Proxima Centauri. Here, several planets have been detected, some in the so-called habitable zone around their star. Sending a probe to the nearest exoplanet is a daunting challenge, but not impossible, even with today's technology.
So even getting a probe accelerated up to 1/10 the speed of light would be extraordinarily technically challenging. And that would then take 40 years to get to Proxima Cen. The difficulty being that it would have to be extremely small to get it accelerated up to that velocity. So it's not entirely clear that it would have a big instrument package on it. The other problem is that it wouldn't actually contain probably an engine that would enable it to slow down. So it would essentially fly through the Proxima Cen system at 1/10 the speed of light. And so it would essentially take a bunch of pictures very quickly and try to send some information back, and then you'd have to wait another 4 years for that information to get back. Look, I think it's an interesting idea. Whether it's a cost-effective use of our time, I'm not entirely sure. I think probably rather than trying to work out how to make a very small probe accelerated up to that velocity and then fling it at Proxima Cen would be developing the techniques for building sort of space-based, the very complex space-based telescopes that would enable you to block out the light from Proxima Cen and try to actually image the planet itself, to do direct imaging, unlike Doppler wobble, unlike transit searches where you're only seeing the star and the effect the planet has. Try to actually see the planet itself, then try to get spectra of that planet to understand better what's actually going on its surface.
It appears, with all the evidence at hand, the sum of the Drake equation would currently be 1+. We are the 1. The plus is the possibility of technological intelligence within our stellar neighborhood of 1,000 stars. The odds are not good. It's not a question of the available environments, of which there are many. It's to do with the timing. Our time slice within the immense age of the universe may well leave us bereft of company for thousands of years, before our emergence and after we are gone.